There is something in your life that keeps repeating, not as noise, not as a clear answer, but as a quiet signal that refuses to leave, and you feel it without fully understanding it, like something is trying to reach you from beneath the surface of everything you see. And Ibn Arabi would say this is where most people misunderstand their reality, because they think Allah is silent, when in truth, Allah is always speaking through what enters your life, through what is removed, through the timing you cannot control, through the patterns you keep overlooking. But the hidden reason you cannot hear Him is not because the message is missing, it is because your way of listening is still tied to what is obvious. And as long as you expect clarity to come loudly, you will miss what is being given quietly, because the ones who begin to hear are not the ones who search harder. They are the ones whose hearts become still enough to recognize that what they thought was silence was never silent at all. You were listening with the struck mind, not the heart. You learn to listen in a way that depends on clarity, structure, and explanation. You were taught that understanding comes through analysis, that meaning must be defined, and that truth should appear in a form that can be organized and confirmed. So when you search for guidance, you turn to your thoughts first. You try to interpret, compare, and reach conclusions that feel certain. This way of listening feels reliable, but it is limited to what can be explained. The mind moves through what is visible. It arranges ideas, measures possibilities, and seeks answers that fit within what it already knows. It looks for direction in a way that is direct and unmistakable. It prefers what can be named, what can be repeated, and what can be proven. When guidance does not appear in this form, the mind begins to question whether anything is being given at all. But the heart does not move in the same way. The heart does not require explanation to recognize meaning. It does not depend on structure to understand what is present. It receives in a quieter way, through a kind of awareness that is not built on logic, but on perception. It feels true before it can be explained. It recognizes alignment and misalignment without needing to justify it. When you rely only on your mind, you begin to miss what cannot be translated into clear answers. You wait for something that can be easily understood, while something deeper is already being shown to you in a different form. You look for certainty, while the heart is pointing toward direction. And because direction does not always come with clear language, you assume nothing is there. This creates a distance between you and what you are meant to receive. You begin to believe that guidance must come in a way that removes all doubt, that it should feel complete and final. But what is given to the heart often arrives in a way that invites awareness rather than conclusion. It asks you to notice, to feel, and to remain present with what is unfolding rather than to immediately define it. There are things you have felt without being able to explain them. A quiet discomfort in certain spaces, a sense of ease with certain people, a pull toward something that does not have a clear reason, a hesitation that appears without warning. These are not random reactions. They are forms of understanding that the heart recognizes before the mind can arrange them. When these feelings arise, the mind often interrupts. It asks for proof, for reasons, for something that can be confirmed. If it cannot find this, it dismisses what was felt. It replaces the quiet clarity of the heart with the louder uncertainty of thought. And in doing so, it moves you away from what was being shown to you. The heart does not compete with the mind, but it cannot be heard when the mind dominates every moment of attention. If your inner space is filled with constant analysis, comparison, and questioning, there is little room for the subtle movements of the heart to become clear. They remain present, but they are overlooked. Listening with the heart requires a different kind of attention. It is not about stopping thought completely, but about allowing space where thought is not in control of everything. In that space, you begin to notice what you feel without immediately trying to explain it. You allow impressions to remain as they are, without forcing them into conclusions. As this space opens, something begins to shift. You start to recognize patterns that you did not notice before. You begin to see how certain experiences repeat, how certain feelings return, and how certain directions quietly form without being announced. You notice that what you feel carries consistency, even when it does not carry clear explanation. This recognition builds trust. Not a blind trust, but a steady awareness that your heart is not reacting without reason. It is responding to something real, even if that reality cannot always be described in simple terms. The more you allow this awareness to remain, the clearer it becomes. You begin to understand that guidance is not always something you think your way into. It is something you become aware of through presence. It reveals itself through how you feel, through what draws you, through what unsettles you, and through what continues to return to your attention without force. When you shift from listening only with the mind to allowing the heart to be present, you do not lose clarity. You gain a different kind of clarity, one that is not dependent on explanation but on recognition. This does not mean the mind has no place. It still organizes, reflects, and helps you move through what you understand. But it is no longer the only way you listen. It becomes a support, not the center. The heart remains the place where meaning first arrives. And when you begin to listen from there, what once felt silent starts to feel filled with direction. Not because something new has begun to speak, but because you are no longer limiting yourself to the way you were taught to hear. Your inner world is too occupied to notice. You do not fail to notice guidance because it is absent. You fail to notice it because there is no space left within you for it to settle. Your inner world is not empty or still. It is filled with constant movement, thoughts, overlapping thoughts, emotions rising without pause, concerns pulling your attention in different directions at the same time. Even when you are physically quiet, something inside you remains active, as if silence is something your inner state has forgotten how to hold. This activity does not always appear as noise. It can feel like thinking, planning, remembering, worrying, imagining. It can feel productive, even necessary. You move from one thought to another without noticing how full your attention has become. And in this fullness, subtle things do not find a place to remain. Guidance does not always arrive in a form that competes with this movement. It does not force itself through your thoughts. It does not demand attention in a way that interrupts everything else. It appears gently, often as a quiet awareness, a slight shift in feeling, a subtle recognition that passes through you. If your inner space is crowded, this recognition does not disappear, but it does not stay long enough to be understood. You may have experienced this without realizing it. A moment where something felt clear for an instant, then quickly faded as your thoughts returned. A sense of direction that appeared softly, then became uncertain as you began to analyze it. A feeling that something was right or not right, but before you could remain with it, your attention moved elsewhere. These are not incomplete signals. They are complete in their nature, but they require stillness to be received. When your inner world is occupied, you are always moving away from what is subtle. Your attention is drawn toward what is louder within you. Strong emotions, urgent thoughts, repeating concerns, these take priority because they are easier to notice. They feel more immediate. They hold your focus without effort, and because of this, the quieter forms of awareness are overshadowed. This is not something you are doing intentionally. It has become a habit of being. You have learned to remain engaged with your thoughts, to follow them, to give them importance. Over time, this engagement becomes constant, and the idea of inner stillness begins to feel unfamiliar. When there is no thought to follow, it can even feel uncomfortable, as if something is missing. But nothing is missing. What is present in that space is simply unfamiliar. The heart recognizes what the mind does not immediately understand. It receives impressions that do not require explanation. But if the mind is always active, it does not allow these impressions to remain. It interrupts, questions, replaces. It moves so quickly that the heart does not have time to reveal what it has received. Creating space within does not mean forcing yourself into silence. It begins with noticing the movement itself, seeing how your thoughts continue without pause, how your attention shifts without rest, how your inner state remains occupied even when nothing external is demanding it. This noticing is the first step toward opening space. As you become aware of this movement, you begin to allow small moments where you are not following every thought. You do not need to stop them. You simply do not give each one your full attention. In these moments, something changes. The inner pressure begins to ease, even slightly. The constant flow becomes less overwhelming. Within this easing, the subtle begins to appear more clearly. You start to notice feelings that were always there, but were previously overlooked. You sense direction in a way that does not require explanation. You feel a quiet clarity that does not compete with your thoughts, but exists alongside them. This clarity is not loud, but it is consistent. The more space you allow, the more familiar this becomes. You realize that guidance was not missing. It was present within the spaces you did not allow yourself to enter. It was waiting in the quiet moments you moved past, in the pauses you filled with more thought, in the stillness you avoided without realizing it. Your inner world does not need to become empty to receive. It needs to become open. Openness is not the absence of thought. It is the absence of constant occupation. It is the ability to allow something to remain without immediately replacing it. When this openness develops, what you receive begins to settle. It stays long enough to be recognized, long enough to be understood. You begin to see that what you were searching for was never far from you. It was within reach of your awareness, but beyond the noise of your attention. And as your inner space becomes less occupied, even in a small way, what once passed unnoticed begins to reveal itself without effort. Not because it has become louder, but because there is finally room for it to be heard. You follow what is loud, not what is true. Your attention has been trained to move toward what stands out. What is clear, visible, and repeated naturally becomes the center of your focus. The louder something appears, the more easily it holds your awareness. This loudness is not only sound. It is anything that demands immediate attention, strong opinions, urgent emotions, obvious outcomes, and constant stimulation from the world around you. Because of this, you begin to associate importance with intensity. What feels strong appears meaningful. What is repeated appears true. What is visible appears certain. And what is subtle begins to feel distant, almost as if it carries less value simply because it does not insist on being noticed. But truth does not always move in this way. It does not compete for your attention. It does not raise its voice to be recognized. It remains steady, present, and quiet. It does not need to prove itself through repetition or force. It reveals itself through consistency, not intensity. And because it does not interrupt your focus, it is often overlooked by a mind that has learned to follow what is loud. You may have experienced moments where something within you felt clear, yet it did not match what was happening around you. The environment pointed in one direction, but your inner sense pointed in another. The louder influence felt convincing, while the quieter awareness felt uncertain, even though it carried a deeper sense of alignment. In such moments, it becomes easier to follow what is loud, not because it is more true, but because it is easier to recognize. Loudness simplifies decisions. It removes hesitation by presenting something that appears definite. It fills the space with direction, leaving little room for doubt. But this clarity is often surface level. It is built on what is immediate, not on what is lasting. Truth, on the other hand, does not always remove uncertainty. it can exist alongside it. It appears as a quiet understanding, a sense that something is right or not right without needing to explain why. It does not force you into action. It invites you to notice. This invitation is easy to ignore when your attention is occupied by what is more obvious. You may find yourself following paths that feel urgent but not aligned, responding to situations that demand reaction but not reflection, and making choices based on what is visible rather than what is deeply felt. Afterward, a quiet awareness may remain, showing you that something was not fully aligned, even if everything appeared correct on the surface. This awareness is not new. It was present before the decision was made, but it did not hold your attention long enough to guide you. It remained in the background while louder influences moved to the front. This creates a pattern. You begin to trust what is loud more than what is true. You give more importance to what is clear externally than to what is clear internally. And slowly, your connection to that inner clarity becomes less familiar, not because it has disappeared, but because it has not been given space to remain. Returning to what is true requires a shift in how you give attention. It is not about rejecting what is loud, but about not allowing it to become the only thing you follow. It is about recognizing that loudness does not equal truth, and quietness does not equal absence. When you begin to see this, your attention starts to change. You become more aware of the difference between intensity and clarity. Intensity pulls you quickly. It creates urgency and demands a response. Clarity does not rush you. It remains steady, even when you do not immediately act on it. It stays consistent, returning in the same form without forcing itself. As you begin to notice this difference, you start to pause before following what is loud. You allow yourself to remain with what is quiet for a little longer. You give attention to what you feel without needing it to become stronger or more obvious. Something becomes clearer. You begin to recognize that what is true has been present all along, not hidden, but simply not emphasized. It did not compete, so it was not chosen, but it remained unchanged, waiting to be noticed rather than pursued. This recognition does not come from effort alone. It comes from a change in how you relate to what appears within you. You begin to trust what is consistent rather than what is intense. You begin to listen to what remains rather than what overwhelms. As this shift deepens, your decisions begin to reflect a different kind of awareness. You are no longer pulled only by what stands out. You are guided by what stays steady beneath it. The surface no longer determines your direction in the same way. You realize that truth does not need to be loud to be real, and once you begin to listen for what is quiet, you start to notice that it was always there, holding a form of clarity that did not change, even when everything around it did. What changes is not the presence of truth, but your willingness to give it your attention without requiring it to become louder than everything else. What leaves you was also a message. You often measure meaning by what remains. What stays feels important, what continues feels valuable, and what lasts appears to carry purpose. So, when something leaves your life, whether it is a person, a plan, an opportunity, or a feeling, you naturally turn toward questions. You wonder why it ended, what you could have done differently, or whether something was lost that should have been kept. But not everything that leaves is a loss in the way it first appears. Some departures are not removals without meaning. They are forms of direction that do not arrive through addition, but through absence. They reshape your path by creating space where something no longer belongs, even if your understanding has not yet caught up to that change. You may have held on to things that once felt right, that once aligned with who you were, that once gave you a sense of clarity or connection. When they begin to fade or are taken away, the change feels sudden, even if it unfolded gradually. What was familiar becomes distant, and what was stable becomes uncertain. In this transition, it is easy to focus only on what is no longer there. Your attention moves toward what has been removed, toward the gap it created, toward the feeling of something incomplete. You try to return to what it was, to restore what has shifted, to hold on to what is already moving away. This effort comes from a desire to preserve meaning, but it can prevent you from seeing the meaning within the departure itself, because what leaves you carries its own form of guidance, not in the form of explanation, but in the form of movement. It redirects your attention, your energy, and your direction, even when you resist that redirection. It shows you what is no longer aligned with your path, even if you are not ready to accept that change. There are things that remain in your life because they continue to match your state, your awareness, and your direction. And there are things that leave because they no longer fit within what is unfolding within you. This does not always feel fair or understandable. It often feels abrupt, incomplete, or unresolved. But alignment is not always comfortable. When something no longer aligns, it cannot remain in the same way. It begins to loosen, to shift, to move away, either gradually or all at once. This movement is not random. It follows a deeper order that is not always visible to you in the moment. You may feel that something was taken from you, but what you are experiencing is a form of transition. What was once part of your path has completed its place within it. What it brought you, whether understanding, growth, or awareness, has already been given. What remains is not the thing itself, but what it has left within you. When you focus only on what has gone, you remain connected to the absence rather than the meaning. You continue to look for what is no longer present, instead of recognizing what has already been integrated into you through that experience. The heart does not lose everything when something leaves. It retains what was real within it. This is why certain departures stay with you, not as pain alone, but as a form of understanding. You carry what you learned, what you felt, and what became clear through that connection or experience. Even if the form is no longer present, its ether remains within you in a way that continues to shape how you see and respond. This is part of the message. What leaves does not always take everything with it. It removes its presence, but it leaves behind its meaning, and that meaning is often what you were meant to receive from it. If everything remained, there would be no movement. Your path would become fixed, unable to adjust, unable to refine, unable to move toward what is more aligned with your awareness. Departure creates space for that movement. It allows your direction to shift, even if that shift feels uncertain. This does not mean every loss is easy to accept. The heart feels what it loses. It experiences the absence, the change, and the distance that follows. This feeling is not something to avoid. It is part of how the heart processes what has changed. But within this feeling, there is also an invitation to see differently. Instead of asking only why something left, you begin to ask what it revealed. What did it show you about yourself? What did it make you aware of? What did it bring into your understanding that was not there before? These questions do not remove the feeling of loss, but they bring meaning into it. They allow you to see that what happened was not without purpose, even if that purpose is still unfolding. You begin to notice that certain things left at the same time something within you was changing. Your awareness was shifting, your perspective was evolving, your direction was becoming clearer in ways that were not obvious before. The departure and the inner change are connected, even if the connection is not immediately clear. This is how guidance moves through removal, not by explaining itself, but by creating conditions that lead you toward a different path. It closes one space so that another can open. It removes what no longer fits so that you are not held back by what has already served its place. When you begin to see it this way, your relationship with what leaves begins to change. You no longer see departure as something empty or meaningless. You begin to recognize it as part of a larger movement that is shaping your path, even when you do not fully understand it. You allow yourself to feel the change, but you do not remain fixed in the absence. You begin to notice what is opening, what is shifting, and what is becoming possible in the space that has been created. And in this noticing, something becomes clearer. What was left was not only something that ended, it was also something that pointed you forward, not through words, but through the direction it created when it was no longer there. Guidance rarely feels like certainty. You have been taught to expect guidance in a form that removes doubt completely, something clear, unmistakable, and direct. A feeling that settles every question at once, leaving no space for hesitation. Because of this expectation, you assume that if you were truly being guided, you would feel fully sure, without confusion, without inner movement. But what is given to you does not always arrive in that form. Guidance does not always come as a final answer. It often appears as a direction that unfolds gradually, without announcing itself as complete. It moves through your awareness in a way that invites attention rather than conclusion. And because it does not immediately resolve everything, it can feel uncertain. This uncertainty is not the absence of guidance. It is part of how guidance reaches you. When something is given to your heart, it does not always arrive with explanation. It may come as a quiet inclination, a subtle pull, or a sense that one direction carries more ease than another. It may appear as a feeling that does not fully explain itself, yet remains consistent beneath your thoughts. The mind, in its search for clarity, becomes unsettled by this. It asks for confirmation, for guarantees, for something that can remove all possibility of error. It wants to know before moving, to be certain before taking a step. And when that certainty is not present, it begins to question whether what you are sensing is real at all. This is where confusion begins. Not because guidance is unclear, but because it is being measured by a standard it was never meant to meet. Guidance is not always about knowing the full path. It is about recognizing the next step, even when the rest remains unseen. It does not always give you the outcome. It gives you a direction and asks you to move with awareness. This movement requires trust, not blind trust, but a willingness to remain present with what you feel, even when it is not fully explained. It asks you to stay with the subtle sense of alignment, even when it does not become louder or more obvious. There are times when you feel drawn towards something without being able to justify it completely. You may feel a quiet clarity about a choice, even while your mind continues to question it. You may sense that something is not right, even when there is no clear reason to step away. These experiences are not incomplete. They are forms of guidance that have not been shaped into certainty. Certainty belongs to the mind. Guidance belongs to the heart. The heart does not always need to know everything before it moves. It recognizes what aligns and what does not, even when the details remain unclear. It feels the difference between what carries ease and what carries resistance, even if that resistance cannot be fully explained. When you begin to accept this, your relationship with uncertainty begins to change. You no longer see it as something that must be removed before you act. You begin to understand that uncertainty can exist alongside direction. It does not always mean you are lost. It can mean you are being asked to move without needing to see the entire path. This does not make decisions effortless. There is still hesitation, still questioning, still moments where you pause and reflect. But within this, there is also a quiet awareness that continues to return, pointing you in a certain direction, even when you try to ignore it. This return is important. It shows you that what you are sensing is not random. It does not disappear when you stop thinking about it. It remains steady and consistent beneath the movement of your thoughts. This consistency is not loud, but it is reliable. You begin to recognize this pattern. You see that what felt uncertain at first carried a form of clarity that revealed itself through movement. What you did not fully understand at the beginning became clearer as you followed it. What you hesitated to trust began to show its direction through experience. This does not remove uncertainty completely, but it changes how you relate to it. You stop waiting for a moment where everything feels perfectly clear. You begin to move with what you do understand, even if it is only a small part of the whole. You allow the rest to unfold as you remain attentive. In doing so, you begin to see that certainty is not always the goal. Awareness is. When you are aware, you are present with what is given. You notice the direction, the feeling, the movement that is unfolding. You do not need to force clarity, because clarity develops as you remain engaged with what you are receiving. This way of moving is quieter. It does not announce itself with confidence that removes all doubt. It carries a steadiness that remains, even when questions arise. It allows you to move without needing to control every outcome. And in this movement, something becomes clearer. Guidance was not meant to eliminate uncertainty. It was meant to teach you how to move within it without losing your awareness. So what you feel is not confusion. It is the beginning of a different kind of understanding, one that does not rely on certainty to be real, but on consistency to be recognized. You mistook silence for distance. You began to believe that when you could not sense anything clearly, it meant nothing was there. When answers did not come in the form you expected, when clarity did not appear in a way you could recognize, you slowly formed an assumption that you were distant, that something had withdrawn, that what you were seeking was no longer near. This assumption did not come from certainty. It came from the way you were taught to recognize presence. You were taught that presence must be felt strongly, that it should comfort you in obvious ways, that it should respond when you call in a form that removes your questions. So when you did not feel this, you interpreted the absence of that feeling as a sign of distance. But what you were calling silence was not emptiness. It was a form of presence that did not match your expectation. There are ways of being close that do not announce themselves. They do not interrupt your thoughts, they do not overwhelm your senses, and they do not force recognition. They remain steady, constant, and quiet. They do not move in and out. They remain, whether you notice them or not. When your attention is fixed on what is obvious, you begin to overlook what is subtle. You search for signs that stand out, for feelings that confirm, for clarity that removes uncertainty. And when these do not appear, you conclude that nothing is there. But the absence of what is loud is not the absence of what is real. You may have experienced moments where everything felt still, where nothing seemed to be happening, where your attempts to find direction felt unanswered. In those moments, your mind may have filled the space with questions. It may have tried to interpret the stillness as distance, as disconnection, as something missing. Yet within that stillness, something was present, not in the form of answers, but in the form of space. Space that allows you to become aware without interference. Space that is not filled with immediate responses, so that your attention can begin to settle. This space may feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because it does not provide the kind of feedback you are used to receiving. But it is not empty. It is simply not crowded. When you are accustomed to constant input, silence can feel like absence. When your inner state is used to movement, stillness can feel like distance. But what you are feeling is not separation. It is the removal of what was previously filling your awareness. This removal creates a condition where something deeper can be noticed. If you remain with the silence without trying to escape it, without trying to replace it, you begin to notice that it carries its own form of clarity, not a clarity that speaks in words, but a clarity that exists in the absence of distraction. You begin to feel a steadiness that does not depend on constant reassurance. This steadiness was always there. It was simply not noticed while your attention was occupied. The feeling of distance often comes from the expectation that something should respond in a way that confirms its presence. When that response does not come, the mind interprets it as absence. But presence does not always respond. It does not always change its form to match your need for confirmation. It remains as it is. Your role is not to make it appear differently. Your role is to recognize it as it is. When this recognition begins, your experience of silence changes. It no longer feels like something you are separated from. It begins to feel like something you are within. The distance you thought existed starts to dissolve, not because something has moved closer, but because your perception has shifted. You begin to see that what you were searching for was not outside the silence, it was within it. This does not mean that every moment of stillness will feel clear or comforting. There are times when silence will continue to feel uncertain, but within that uncertainty, there is also an opportunity to remain present without needing immediate answers. As you stay with it, your sensitivity to what is subtle begins to grow. You start to notice small shifts that you would have overlooked before, a sense of calm that appears without reason, a quiet understanding that settles without explanation, a feeling that something is aligned even if you cannot fully describe it. These are not new experiences. They were always there, but they were hidden beneath the expectation of something louder. When that expectation begins to soften, what is quiet becomes more visible, and what once felt like distance begins to reveal itself as a form of closeness that was never absent. You were not left without connection. You were surrounded by a presence that did not need to announce itself, and the silence you questioned was not a sign that you were far, but a space where you were being brought closer in a way you had not yet learned to recognize. You never slowed down enough to notice. Your life has been moving at a pace that keeps your attention occupied almost constantly. Even when you are not physically busy, your inner state continues to move quickly. Thoughts follow one another without pause. Decisions are made in response to what feels urgent, and your awareness is drawn from one point to another before it has time to settle. In this movement, you begin to believe that clarity should appear within the same speed, that understanding should come as quickly as your attention shifts. But what is subtle does not appear in what is fast. It requires a different condition to be seen. When everything moves quickly, your attention does not stay long enough in one place to notice what is beneath it. You pass through experiences without fully receiving them. You hear words without sensing their depth. You see events without recognizing their meaning, not because meaning is absent, but because your attention does not remain still long enough for it to become clear. This pace becomes familiar. It feels normal to move from one thing to another without pause. It feels natural to fill silence with more thought, to replace stillness with activity, and to keep your awareness engaged with what is immediately in front of you. Slowing down can even feel uncomfortable, as if something is being left unfinished or something important is being missed. But what you are missing is not in what you are moving toward, it is in what you are moving past. There are patterns in your life that repeat quietly. There are moments that carry meaning beneath their surface. There are feelings that arise gently without demanding your attention. These are not separate from your life. They are part of it. But they do not reveal themselves when your attention is always in motion. When you begin to slow down, even slightly, your experience changes. Slowing down does not mean stopping everything. It means allowing your attention to remain where it is, without immediately moving away. It means giving yourself time to stay with what you are experiencing, rather than quickly moving to the next thought, the next task, or the next distraction. In this slowing, something begins to appear. You start to notice details that were previously overlooked, a feeling that stays a little longer, a thought that carries more depth than you first realized, a situation that reveals a pattern you had not seen before. These are not new occurrences. They were always present, but your pace did not allow you to recognize them. The heart perceives in a way that is not rushed. It does not process through speed. It receives through presence. When you are fully present with what is in front of you, without dividing your attention, The heart begins to reveal what it has been sensing all along. This is why slowing down changes how you understand your life. You begin to see connections between experiences that once felt separate. You notice how certain events lead into others, how certain feelings return in similar forms, how certain directions begin to take shape without being forced. This recognition does not come from effort alone. It comes from giving your awareness the time it needs to settle. Without this settling, everything appears fragmented. Moments feel disconnected, feelings feel unclear, and direction feels uncertain. You move through experiences without seeing how they relate to each other. You search for meaning in what appears incomplete, without realizing that the incompleteness comes from not remaining present long enough. As you slow down, this fragmentation begins to ease. You no longer experience everything as separate. You begin to see continuity, a flow that connects what is happening in a way that was not visible before. This flow does not force itself into your awareness. It becomes clear when you are not rushing past it. There is also a quietness that comes with slowing down. Not a silence that feels empty, but a stillness that allows your awareness to deepen. In this stillness, your thoughts become less dominant. They do not disappear, but they no longer control your attention completely. You begin to notice what exists beneath them. This is where recognition begins. You start to feel what is aligned without needing to analyze it immediately. You begin to sense what carries meaning without forcing it into explanation. You allow understanding to form gradually, rather than demanding it all at once. This way of being may feel unfamiliar at first. You may feel the urge to return to movement, to fill the space, to move forward before something has fully settled. But as you remain with it, even for short periods, you begin to see its value. You begin to notice that what you understand in stillness carries a depth that what you understand in haste does not. Slowing down does not remove the movement of life. It changes how you relate to it. You continue to move, to act, and to respond. But your awareness is no longer scattered. It becomes more centered, more attentive, more capable of recognizing what is present without needing to rush toward what is next. What once felt hidden becomes easier to notice. Not because it has changed, but because you are no longer moving past it before it has the chance to reveal itself. The message was always there, you were not ready. Yet you often think of understanding as something that arrives from outside you, as if clarity is given only when the right moment appears, or when something finally changes in your circumstances. So when you do not understand what is happening, you assume the meaning has not been given yet, that the answer has not arrived, or that you are still waiting for something to be shown to you. But what if what you are waiting for has already been present? Not hidden, not delayed, not withheld, simply not recognized. There are things in your life that have repeated in quiet ways, patterns that returned without announcing themselves. Feelings that appeared more than once, even when you tried to move past them. Situations that seemed familiar, as if they carried a meaning you could not fully grasp. These were not random occurrences. They were forms of communication that did not force themselves into your awareness, but remained available for you to notice. The difficulty was not in their presence, it was in your readiness to receive them. Readiness is not about effort alone, it is about the condition of your awareness. When your attention is directed outward, when your focus is tied to expectations, when your understanding depends on clear explanations, what is subtle does not become clear. It remains present, but it does not settle into recognition. You may have encountered the same kind of experience more than once, yet each time it felt incomplete. You moved through it without fully understanding what it was showing you. You may have sensed that something was being pointed toward, but the meaning remained just beyond your grasp. This did not happen because the message was unclear. It happened because your way of seeing was not yet aligned with what was being shown. Understanding does not only depend on what is given, It depends on how it is received. When your inner state begins to change, your perception changes with it. What once felt confusing begins to make sense. What once seemed unrelated begins to connect. What once felt uncertain begins to carry a quiet clarity. This shift does not come from something new being added. It comes from your awareness becoming capable of recognizing what was already there. You begin to see that certain moments in your life were not isolated events. They were part of a continuous movement, each one carrying a piece of meaning that only becomes clear when you are able to see it in relation to the others. Without this connection, everything appears fragmented. With it, a pattern begins to form. This pattern was not created the moment you recognized it. It existed before your recognition. What changed was your ability to see it. There is a time when the heart is not yet ready to receive what it is being shown. Not because it is incapable, but because it is still occupied with other ways of understanding. It is still looking for answers in places where answers do not appear. It is still expecting clarity to come in forms that do not match the nature of what is being given. As your awareness becomes more still, more attentive, and more open, something begins to shift. You start to notice what you previously overlooked. You begin to recognize meanings that were always present but did not remain in your attention. You feel a sense of familiarity, as if what you are now seeing is not entirely new, but something you have encountered before in a different way. This familiarity is important. It shows you that understanding is not always about discovering something for the first time. It is often about recognizing something that has been with you, waiting for the moment when you are able to receive it fully. You may realize that what you once questioned now feels clear without effort. What you once tried to force into understanding now settles naturally. What once felt distant now feels close. Not because it has moved, but because your perception has changed. This does not mean you were unaware before. It means your awareness has deepened. With this depth, your relationship with what you experience begins to change. You no longer move through events only on the surface. You begin to sense the layers within them. You begin to see how what is happening is connected to what has happened, and how both are part of a direction that is unfolding without needing to be forced. This recognition brings a different kind of ease. Not the ease of having all answers, but the ease of not needing everything to be explained immediately. You become more patient with what you do not yet understand, because you begin to trust that understanding is not absent. It is forming in a way that requires time, attention, and openness. You no longer feel that you are waiting for something to begin. You begin to see that it has already been unfolding. The message was not delayed. It was present in every experience, in every pattern, in every feeling that returned without being fully understood. It remained consistent, even when you did not recognize it. And as your awareness becomes more aligned with what it receives, that consistency becomes clear. Not as something new, but as something that was always there, waiting for you to become ready enough to see it as it is. And maybe now, the question is no longer, why can't I hear? Maybe the question has changed. Because once you begin to see this, you realize something unsettling, but also freeing. Nothing in your life was ever random. Nothing was ever truly silent. Nothing was ever without meaning. What you called confusion was a direction you couldn't yet read. What you called distance was a form of closeness you didn't recognize. And the moment your heart begins to quiet, even slightly, you start to notice something different. Not louder, but clearer. Because Allah was never waiting to speak. You were learning how to listen.